Hey fellas, how you doing? So, while doing research for this video, I came across a really funny picture of Frank Miller, and I just want all of you to bask in its greatness with me for a little bit before we go ahead and get started with the rest of this video. Now, you guys may not like it, but this is what the peak male form looks like. Why does it look like Frank Miller is making bedroom eyes at me? Why does it look like the cover of the comic book he's holding was photoshopped out? Why is he wearing Freddy Krueger's hat? I would like to tell you I had the answers to these questions, my friends, but I'm just as stumped as the rest of you. But at the same time, I just can't stop looking at this image. I love it. I want to get it blown up and put on my wall. I want to make abstract art replicas of this photo and just hang them up around the town I live in. This looks like a dating profile picture, and it's so great in all of the worst ways. I'm gonna pay an inmate on death row to get this tattooed on their back and just never explain why. Alright, moving on now. Alright, so in 1986, Frank Miller wrote a little book called The Dark Knight Returns, probably the most popular and influential Batman story ever written, with the worst sequel ever written. And I'll be honest, the second one put me off so much that I'm never even going to touch the third one. And based on everything I heard, that's more Brian Azzarello's baby than Frank Miller's. And I think Brian Azzarello is doo-doo, so I'm not going to read it. But the point is that this story was super important for its time. It took the direction that Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil's Batman was already heading in, a darker alternative to the 1960s Batman TV show, which still dominated the image of Batman in popular culture, and cranked that darkening of the character up to 11. And a year later, Frank Miller was given the reins to recreate Batman's origin story, reimagining it in his trademark neo-noir style, inspiring the first of the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy films, Batman Begins, and a few years later being adapted in animated form in Batman Year One. And in my opinion, between The Dark Knight Returns and this one, this is the much stronger book. And don't even get me started on The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And this was so successful that in 1993, Marvel went to Frank Miller and asked if they could give one of their guys the same treatment. A gritty reimagining of Daredevil's origin story a la Batman Year One. And when you consider the fact that Frank Miller had already had a pretty good Daredevil run back in the 80s, it was a pretty solid choice to go with. And that's how we got Daredevil, the Man Without Fear, which would later go on to be loosely adapted by Netflix's Daredevil show. And I gotta say, both of these books are prime Frank Miller. They're both these gritty tales of stoic resolve. God, I'm starting to sound like a broken record reusing these terms over and over again. But you get what I'm saying, right? They're stories about these two terribly broken men who rise above it and find ways to become heroes in whatever means they can. And there's an old quote by Frank Miller that floats around whenever anybody talks about noir or neo-noir. The noir hero is a knight in blood-kicked armor. He's dirty and does his best to deny the fact that he's a hero the whole time. If that quote sends a shiver down your spine, then reading Sin City would really curl your toes. But I digress. So it's pretty clear that these two stories share a lot of the same DNA. And it's not just because they were written by the same guy, but Batman and Daredevil have always kind of been kindred spirits. So much so that there was actually a Batman and Daredevil crossover event back in the day. Two guys without powers in these insane worlds where single individuals could basically hold the world hostage. They're that powerful. Meanwhile, we have a guy wearing a cape and a guy who dresses up like the devil beating up muggers and gangsters, and the occasional assassin who is renowned for never missing. There's a lot of parallels there when you look at them from a surface level. But as Frank Miller himself points out in the introduction of Daredevil, the Man Without Fear, it's the fact that Matt Murdock had a lot more of a reason to go rogue in his life than Bruce Wayne ever did. Miller said himself that Matt had every reason to become a villain. He grew up poor, destitute. His father was killed for the first honorable act he had attempted in years. Meanwhile, Bruce was a spoiled rich kid whose father already had something of a messiah complex. So that manifesting in the Batman persona is like a natural conclusion to that. Meanwhile, Matt embracing the mantle of Daredevil is more like a man taming his inner demon. Or if you want to get Jungian about this, learning to embrace his shadow and wear it like a suit of armor. But let's talk about year one first, because that's the older of these two tales. The once definitive origin story of Batman, now relegated to non-canon status. What's funny about this story is that it actually split protagonist duties between Jim Gordon and Bruce Wayne, as Jim is a newcomer to Gotham, recently transferred in from Chicago, and Bruce has just returned from his years of training abroad. With the latter's first outing as a crime fighter, what was supposed to be a simple undercover recon mission as a prototype to match as Malone, resulted in him getting stabbed and almost bleeding to death in his father's study, before a bat crashed through their window and landed on a bust of his father. Meanwhile, Gordon is portrayed as this ex-Special Forces hard-ass, who almost immediately starts getting singled out for not being as corrupt as the rest of the Gotham PD, gets assaulted by his own partner Arnold Flass, and then gives Arnold Flass the beatdown of a lifetime. The kind of cathartic moment that's always stood out in my head in this story. I guess my point is that there's a great dichotomy between the two protagonists. An aging warrior finding that spark, that reason to live again, and a young man finally embracing the role he was essentially destined to always play. And we get to see Bruce screw up a lot on his first outings as Batman, including almost accidentally killing a pretty petty burglar and finding himself cornered by an entire SWAT team. But then we also get scenes like this really highlighting Batman's mastery of tactical thinking. This theatrical declaration of war against the upper crust of Gotham City, corrupt politicians and mafia family leaders all. But I would say if there's one weakness to this story is that it doesn't really explore the detective side of Batman. But you could also argue that since this is only a 4-issue miniseries, it would kind of bloat the narrative, possibly even drag down the pacing if they try to add a murder mystery in on top of all of that. I'm gonna be honest, I'm running out of things to say about this miniseries. It's a true classic that holds up whether you're a fan of Frank Miller or not. It's grounded and gritty without being over the top or gratuitous. Its characters are flawed and nuanced. And the two protagonists play off of each other so well that it really grounds the friendship the two develop over the years of working together. There's a reason why, even today, people still talk about Batman Year 1, and nobody talks about Batman Year 0. Its new canonical replacement written by Scott Snyder, whose run started off pretty good back in 2012, and quickly descended into total chaos. I liked the horror elements he added to Batman with the Court of Owls, and then the Joker looking more like Leatherface in the Death of the Family story arc, but I'm getting lost in the weeds here. If you're new to Batman, Year 1 is always the place I recommend people to start at, and that's all I have to say about that. Alright, so we all know that Batman is a complete hack fraud when it comes to martial arts. He's not even considered an honorary member of the Black Dragon Fighting Society. We have never once seen him use a George Dillman-style no-touch knockout. We've never once seen him use the Dance of Death or the Dim Mak. But what about Daredevil? Where does he stand on the whole real or fake martial artist? Well, unfortunately, much like Batman, he seems restricted to using physical contact to win his fights, instead of using chi balls and no-touch knockouts to win the day. For shame, who'd have thought these guys were such weakling frauds? What the hell am I even talking about at this point? Alright, we're transitioning into talking about Daredevil the Man Without Fear. The story that introduced the black suit for Daredevil, the one where he wears a bandana over his eyes and basically just a tracksuit. Mostly because in this version of Daredevil's origin story, he was never really intending on becoming a full-time crime fighter. He even leaves New York for Boston after getting his law degree, working as a corporate lawyer in the land of the rich snobs. And unlike Batman Year 1, each of these stories seems to revolve around Daredevil interacting with a different side character, somebody who had a pretty big impact on his life, with the first issue obviously revolving around Matt and his father, the second and third issues revolving around Matt's relationship with his on-again, off-again girlfriend Elektra, who's basically Daredevil's Talia al Ghul, a badass ninja lady who was actually created by Frank Miller himself back in the 80s, and even got a god-awful film of her own back in the early 2000s. She's one of those characters who's notorious for never really staying dead for very long, but that's not really important for the sake of this story. It establishes their relationship and how they can't be together, and mostly just a prelude to set up the relationship in Frank Miller's main continuity Daredevil run. The Man Without Fear issue number 4 establishes his growing rivalry with the Kingpin, the one and only Wilson Fisk. And I don't care what anybody says, Michael Clark Duncan was a way better Wilson Fisk than the guy who did the Netflix show. Vincent D'Onofrio, that's his name, the Law & Order guy. His version of Wilson Fisk is just a whiny, whipped weirdo. I absolutely hate it. The point I'm trying to make here is that The Man Without Fear allows Daredevil to bounce off his entire supporting cast. Meanwhile, Batman Year One, the only character Batman ever really is contrasted with is Jim Gordon, and the two of them only really interact once or twice throughout the entire story. So we sort of get to see a wider range of who Matt Murdock is as a person, and how he plays off of all the different people in his life, including his mentor Stick, who is a blind ninja guy who is also in the Netflix show. He's another Frank Miller creation. For whatever reason, back in the 80s, Frank Miller was turning everything into ninjas, including adding elements of Japanese crime and swordplay into Wolverine's backstory. But that's something we'll talk about in a later video. But for the most part, the story is about Matt trying to learn how to control the devil inside of him, but constantly finds himself giving into his anger and lashing out violently at most of the bad people around him. And it also goes into how his relationship with Elektra brings out the worst in both of them, making them both incredibly impulsive and prone to making mistakes. His struggle to control his anger boiling over by the last couple of issues, when Matt returns to New York and finds himself in conflict with the forces of Wilson Fisk, going on the warpath after a young girl he was mentoring gets abducted, beating everyone who gets in his way within an inch of their lives, all with a nightstick he stole from a police officer when he was a child and hid in his father's old gym. At this point, Matt knows he can never really leave Hell's Kitchen again. He has fully embraced the devil inside of him and starts wearing it as a suit of armor. The cover of the 5th issue really hammering that point home, showing both the iconic red and his original yellow costume. And I have to say, this story goes to way darker places than Batman Year One did, with Wilson Fisk actively being involved in human trafficking over the course of the story. Like, there's no tap dancing around the issue, they just go there. And it just adds a level of grossness to Wilson Fisk I've never really seen other writers touch on. He just doesn't care. To him, it's all just business and numbers. And it's great in that I want this guy to get his teeth knocked out kind of way, knowing that he always finds a way to bounce back. At the risk of being accused of just glazing Frank Miller, I am going to say that The Man Without Fear is just as good of a starting point for reading Daredevil as Batman Year One is for reading Batman, with the closest second place being Daredevil Yellow by Jeff Loeb. What a surprise, my two favorite comic book writers happen to have my two favorite Daredevil stories. Who could have possibly seen that coming? Now we get to the point of the video that I'm kind of hesitant to touch on. Which of these two stories do I think is better? And it's tough because I like them both in different ways. And just to put this out in the open, I have much less nostalgia for The Man Without Fear than I do for Year One. So there is a chance that might color my perception. But I do think I have to go with Batman Year One as the superior of the two stories. And a lot of that just has to do with the plot surrounding around James Gordon, struggling with the PTSD from his military career, the strain his job is putting on his marriage, the guilt he feels at bringing his son into this cold, corrupt world, and the affair he has with his detective partner, Sarah Essen. Like, all of that stuff is just such good storytelling, such old-fashioned, hard-boiled noir storytelling. Could I have fit any more buzzwords into that sentence? I have no idea. But I do think that just that big focus on one side character helped that story a lot, while the Man Without Fear side characters tend to struggle for panel time, with the exception of that probably being Jack Murdock in issue 1, who we get a pretty good idea of all the sacrifices he made raising Matt, especially after his mother left. Again, both of these are good stories, but if you're new to comic books and Frank Miller, I'm gonna go with Batman Year One over Daredevil The Man Without Fear, partially because I just think it's a little better written, partially because Batman is just the better known pop culture icon, so he's just a little more approachable than other comic book characters are in general. Although there is something I've always hated about the way Year One is presented, and that is the tight cursive script of Bruce Wayne's narrations throughout the story. They can be very difficult to read, and I was actually taught cursive in school. I believe I was one of the last years actually taught cursive in my school district, so I can only imagine if you're under the age of like 25 right now, you probably can't even read this. At least if you're a dirty American like I am. Now, I have been struggling with how to end this video for a while now. These are two very simple, very short stories that had a huge impact on their medium, their respective characters, and pretty much every adaptation of the two characters ever made. There's just so many ways you can say that they're good before you just start repeating yourself. If you're new to comic books, I highly recommend either of these. They're constantly being reprinted, so you should be able to find them in pretty much any used bookstore. You can probably get a digital version of either of these for like $10 if that's your thing. They're just good stories that don't require you to sift through decades of backlogs and continuity. They stand on their own, and even non-comic book fans would be able to appreciate how simple they are. And I think that's just about all I really have to say about this. Sorry the video's a little on the shorter side. I'll try to make the next one a little longer. I know most of you guys like to listen to this stuff in the background while doing something else. But at this point, I would just run the risk of bloating the video for the sake of making a long one than getting to the fucking point. So, you guys have a good one. Keep it clean. Always drink coffee. And if you're interested in supporting the channel, the only way to do so right now is to go to my Patreon. There's just a $1 tier and a $5 tier. And the only supporter I have right now is one of my top commenters, Rob. You can pretty much find him under any of my posts. So, big shout out to Big Rob there. Otherwise, a like and a comment goes really, really far as far as getting this video out and the algorithm goes. And you guys just have a good day, you hear? Or else.